Maria Santos adjusted her name tag nervously as she walked through the gleaming corridors of the Pentagon. The temporary badge hanging from her neck felt heavy, marking her as what everyone assumed she was just another intern hired to fetch coffee and handle menial tasks. At 28, she was older than most interns, but after years of struggle, this was her chance to finally get her foot in the door of government service. The morning had started like any other since she began working there 3 weeks ago. Her supervisor barely looked up from her computer when Maria arrived at the small administrative office tucked away in the building's maze of corridors. Was the type of woman who wore her authority like armor, constantly reminding everyone around her of the hierarchy and where they stood in it. "Maria, we need coffee for the morning briefing," said without lifting her eyes from the screen. "Make sure it's fresh and don't forget the sugar and cream setup. The meeting starts in 20 minutes. Maria nodded, swallowing the familiar taste of disappointment. She had a master's degree in international relations and spoke 4 languages fluently, but here she was, being treated like a glorified waitress. Still, she reminded herself that everyone had to start somewhere, and she was grateful for any opportunity to prove herself. As she prepared the coffee service, wheeling the cart down the polished hallways, Maria couldn't help but wonder if her credentials would ever matter. She had graduated summa cum from Georgetown, spent 2 years working with refugee organizations in Syria, and had written extensively on Middle Eastern politics. But none of that seemed to register with anyone here. To them, she was just the quiet Latina girl who brought coffee. The conference room was already buzzing with activity when she arrived. High-ranking officials in crisp uniforms and expensive suits filled the seats around the massive oak table. Maria had learned to make herself invisible during these moments, setting up quickly and efficiently while the important people discussed matters far above her pay grade. She was arranging the cups when she heard sharp voice cutting through the room's low murmur. "Oh good, the coffee girl is here. Maria, set everything up on the side table and make sure you stay out of the way." Heat rushed to Maria's cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral. She had dealt with worse humiliation in her life. Growing up as the daughter of immigrants, she had learned early that dignity came from within, not from how others chose to see you. As she worked, fragments of conversation drifted over from the table. They were discussing something about intelligence reports from Afghanistan, mentions of troop movements and supply routes. Maria found herself unconsciously listening, her academic training making her naturally analytical about geopolitical situations. "The situation in the Kandahar province is deteriorating faster than we anticipated," one official was saying. "Our local contacts are reporting increased Taliban activity, but we're not getting clear intelligence on their positions." Another voice chimed in. "The problem is communication. Half our translators fled when the situation got bad, and the ones who stayed are too scared to venture into the contested areas." Maria finished setting up the coffee service, but something in the conversation made her pause. She had spent considerable time studying the tribal dynamics of Afghanistan during her graduate work, and she had maintained correspondence with several aid workers and journalists in the region even after her academic focus shifted. She was about to quietly exit when the door opened, and a hush fell over the room. Everyone immediately stood at attention, and Maria felt the shift in energy before she even turned to see who had entered. General Robert Hawkins walked into the room with the kind of presence that commanded instant respect. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His uniform was perfectly pressed, and the array of ribbons and medals on his chest spoke of decades of distinguished service. Maria had heard whispers about General Hawkins during her brief time at the Pentagon. He was a legend in military circles, known for his brilliant tactical mind and his unconventional approaches to complex problems. Some called him demanding and intimidating, but everyone respected his expertise. "Ladies, please be seated," the general said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I apologize for my delay. I trust you've been bringing me up to speed on the Afghanistan situation." As the officials settled back into their chairs, General Hawkins moved toward the head of the table, his eyes scanning the room in what appeared to be his habitual assessment of everything around him. His gaze swept past the assembled officials, past who was beaming at being in the presence of such high-ranking authority, and then it landed on Maria. For a moment their eyes met across the room. Maria expected him to look away immediately, as most high-ranking officials did when they noticed the support staff. But General Hawkins stopped walking. His eyes widened slightly, and she watched as the color drained from his face. The general stood frozen, staring at her with an expression that seemed to mix shock, recognition, and something that looked almost like fear. The room fell silent as everyone noticed their commanding officer had stopped mid-stride, his attention fixed on the young woman by the coffee service. "Sir," one of the colonels ventured carefully, "is everything all right?" But General Hawkins didn't respond. He continued staring at Maria, his mouth slightly open, as if he had seen a ghost. Maria felt her heart racing, confused and increasingly uncomfortable under his intense scrutiny. She had never seen this man before in her life, had no idea why he would react this way to seeing her. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. Maria could feel every pair of eyes in the room shifting between her and the general, trying to understand what was happening. She wanted to disappear, to somehow escape this inexplicable attention that was making her feel exposed and vulnerable. His voice cut through the tension, sharp with annoyance and embarrassment. "Maria, what are you still doing here? I told you to set up the coffee and leave. You're disrupting the meeting." The words seemed to snap General Hawkins out of his trance. He blinked several times, straightened his posture, and cleared his throat. But when he spoke, his voice wasn't quite steady. "Actually," he said, his eyes still fixed on Maria, "I think she should stay." The room erupted in confused murmurs. His face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. "Sir, with respect, she's just an intern. She doesn't have clearance for this level of discussion." General Hawkins finally tore his gaze away from Maria and looked at with an expression that could have frozen water. "I'm well aware of security protocols, Ms., but I believe this young lady might have something valuable to contribute to our discussion." Maria felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Around the table, she could see the barely concealed shock and curiosity on the faces of the officials. This was clearly not normal protocol. "What's your name?" General Hawkins asked, turning back to her with that same intense stare. "Maria Santos, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The general nodded slowly, as if her name confirmed something he had suspected. "Ms. Santos, would you mind taking a seat? I have a feeling you might have some insights about our Afghanistan situation that could prove useful." Looked like she was about to explode. "General Hawkins, I must protest. This is highly irregular. She's temporary staff, she hasn't been vetted for sensitive discussions, and frankly, she doesn't have the background or expertise to contribute anything meaningful to a strategic military briefing." Maria felt humiliation wash over her again, but this time it was mixed with a growing spark of anger. She had spent years building her expertise, had sacrificed and studied and worked harder than most people in this room probably ever had. And yet here was, dismissing her as if she were completely worthless. General Hawkins turned to with a look that made the woman shrink back in her chair. "Ms., I appreciate your concern for protocol. However, I'm curious about Ms. Santos's background. Tell me, what exactly do you know about her qualifications?" Fumbled for words, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Well, she's a temporary intern. Her job is to handle administrative support and, as you can see, coffee service." "I see," the general said, his tone deadly quiet. "And you've reviewed her resume, her educational background, her work experience." The silence that followed made it clear that had done no such thing. She had simply seen Maria's name, noted her temporary status, and assigned her to the most menial tasks available without any consideration of who she actually was or what she might be capable of. General Hawkins turned back to Maria, and this time his expression was different. The shock was still there, but now it was mixed with something that looked like careful assessment. "Ms. Santos," he said, "why don't you tell us about your background? I have a feeling there's more to your story than fetching coffee." Maria felt every eye in the room focused on her. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot she had been holding. This was her moment, possibly the only chance she would ever get to show these people that she was more than what they assumed. She took a deep breath and found her voice. "I have a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown University. I specialized in Middle Eastern studies with a focus on Afghanistan and Pakistan tribal dynamics. I spent 2 years working with the International Rescue Committee in Syrian refugee camps, and I maintained extensive contacts with aid workers and journalists throughout the region." The room was completely silent now, Maria could see the surprise on faces around the table, but she pressed on, her confidence growing with each word. I speak Arabic, Farsi, Pashto, and Dari fluently, in addition to English and Spanish. During my graduate work, I wrote my thesis on the intersection of tribal loyalty and modern insurgency tactics in rural Afghanistan. I've been following the current situation closely, and I believe I understand some of the communication challenges you've been discussing. When she finished speaking, the silence was deafening. General Hawkins was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, while around the table, officials shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. It was who broke the silence, her voice high and defensive. Even if that's true, sir, she still doesn't have proper clearance, and protocol clearly states. Protocol, General Hawkins interrupted, also states that we should utilize all available resources to serve our country effectively. Ms. Santos, you mentioned that you understand some of the communication challenges we're facing. What exactly do you mean by that? Maria took a deep breath, knowing that this was her one chance to prove herself. The room remained silent as she gathered her thoughts, aware that every word she spoke now would determine whether she would continue to be seen as just the coffee girl or as someone with real value to offer. The communication breakdown you're experiencing isn't just about language barriers, she began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. It's about cultural misunderstanding and the breakdown of traditional trust networks that have existed in Afghan society for centuries. She moved slightly away from the coffee cart, unconsciously straightening her shoulders as she continued. When you mentioned that your local contacts are too scared to venture into contested areas, the issue isn't just physical danger. In Pashtun culture, information sharing follows very specific social hierarchies and relationship patterns. Your translators aren't just afraid of Taliban retaliation. They're caught in a cultural bind, where giving information to outsiders violates deep-seated tribal loyalty codes. General Hawkins leaned forward in his chair, his intense gaze never leaving Maria's face. Continue. The tribal elders in Kandahar province operate under a system called an ancient code of conduct that governs everything from hospitality to revenge. Information is a form of currency in this system, and giving it freely to foreign forces can mark someone as a traitor not just to the Taliban, but to their own clan structure. Colonel, a stern-faced man with graying temples, shifted in his seat. Ms. Santos, we're aware of basic cultural considerations. The problem is that we're getting conflicting reports from our sources, and we can't verify the accuracy of the intelligence we're receiving. Maria nodded, recognizing the opening to demonstrate deeper understanding. That's exactly what I mean about cultural misunderstanding. In Afghan society, truth is often contextual rather than absolute. When a tribal leader tells you something, they're not necessarily lying if it turns out to be incorrect. They're giving you their truth based on their relationships, their obligations, and their assessment of what information is safe to share. She paused, seeing some confused looks around the table, and realized she needed to explain more clearly. Let me give you a specific example. Last month, I was corresponding with a journalist who was embedded with aid workers in the Spin area. They reported that local villagers were giving completely contradictory information about Taliban movements to different coalition units operating in the same region. Who had been sitting rigidly in her chair, couldn't contain herself. Sir, I really must object to this irregular briefing from personnel. General Hawkins held up a hand without taking his eyes off Maria. The journalists report, Ms. Santos. What did they discover? It turned out that the villagers weren't trying to deceive anyone. Each group was telling each coalition unit what they believed would keep their village safest. To the unit that seemed more aggressive, they reported Taliban positions that would draw military action away from civilian areas. To the unit that seemed more focused on humanitarian aid, they reported different positions that would encourage protective presence near vulnerable populations. The room fell quiet again as the implications sank in. Major General Richardson, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, leaned forward. Are you suggesting that our intelligence-gathering methods are fundamentally flawed because we're not accounting for the informant's motivations beyond simple accuracy? Exactly, Maria said, feeling a surge of confidence as she realized they were actually listening to her. But it goes deeper than that. The breakdown in communication isn't just happening at the field level. It's happening at every stage of the intelligence chain because we're processing culturally complex information through Western analytical frameworks. She moved closer to the table, her academic training taking over as she fell into the rhythm of explaining complex concepts. In traditional Afghan society, information travels through networks of relationships that have been established over generations. A piece of intelligence might pass through 5 or 6 people before it reaches someone willing to speak to coalition forces, and each person in that chain adds their own interpretation based on their family connections, tribal obligations, and personal safety concerns. General Hawkins was taking notes now, his pen moving rapidly across a legal pad. What do you suggest as a solution? Maria felt her heart racing. This was beyond anything she had imagined when she woke up that morning. We need to change our approach from trying to extract information to building genuine relationships. Instead of relying on paid informants who are often viewed with suspicion by their own communities, we should be identifying and supporting legitimate community leaders who have natural authority and trust. She paused, then continued with growing conviction. I've been following the work of several anthropologists and aid workers who have had success using what they call cultural bridging, essentially finding people who can navigate both worlds authentically. These aren't just translators or paid sources. They're individuals who understand both the local culture and Western objectives, and who can help build the kind of trust that makes accurate information sharing possible. Colonel frowned. That sounds like a long-term strategy. We need actionable intelligence now. I understand the urgency, Maria replied. But even for immediate needs, understanding the cultural context can help you evaluate the intelligence you're already receiving. For instance, if a source tells you that Taliban fighters are moving through a particular area, the accuracy of that information depends heavily on the source's relationship to that area. She moved to the whiteboard at the side of the room, picked up a marker, and began sketching a simple diagram. If the source has family or business connections in the area, the information is more likely to be accurate. If they're reporting about a rival tribe's territory, they might be passing along rumors or deliberately misleading information designed to cause problems for their rivals. As she drew connections between different tribal groups, General Hawkins stood up and walked closer to the board. You're suggesting we need to map not just physical terrain, but social terrain. Exactly, and I think I might be able to help with that. Maria set down the marker and turned back to face the room. Through my contacts in the aid worker and journalist communities, I have access to people who have been living and working in these areas for years. They understand the relationship networks, the tribal dynamics, and the cultural factors that influence information sharing. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as officials leaned toward each other, discussing what they had heard. Maria could see the wheels turning in their minds, and for the first time since she had started working at the Pentagon, she felt like her knowledge and experience were being taken seriously. General Hawkins returned to his seat, but his posture was different now. Where before he had seemed rigid and formal, now he appeared thoughtful and engaged. Ms. Santos, these contacts you mentioned, are they currently active in the region? Several of them are, yes. There's a network of aid workers, journalists, and researchers who have maintained presence in Afghanistan throughout the various conflicts. They're not intelligence operatives, but they have deep cultural understanding and established relationships that go back years or even decades. Major General Richardson looked up from her own notes. And you believe they would be willing to provide insights that could help our mission? Maria chose her words carefully. I believe they would be willing to help if the approach was respectful and if they understood that the goal was to reduce civilian casualties and improve humanitarian conditions. Most of these people went to Afghanistan because they genuinely care about the Afghan people. They're not interested in military action for its own sake, but they are interested in outcomes that make life better for civilians. Who had been growing more agitated throughout the discussion, finally stood up. General Hawkins, I must formally protest this entire proceeding. Ms. Santos is temporary personnel with no security clearance, no formal vetting, and no authority to be making policy suggestions in a classified briefing. This is a serious breach of protocol. The tension in the room was palpable. Maria felt the familiar sting of being dismissed and diminished, but this time she also felt something new, a sense of her own worth and the value of what she had to offer. General Hawkins looked at with an expression that could have melted steel. Ms., you're absolutely right that this is irregular. However, in my experience, irregular situations sometimes require irregular solutions. What I'm hearing from Ms. Santos represents the kind of cultural intelligence that we've been lacking in our Afghanistan operations. He stood up and began packing behind his chair. For months, we've been getting fragmentary intelligence, conflicting reports, and analysis that doesn't quite make sense when we try to act on it. Ms. Santos has just provided the most coherent explanation I've heard for why that might be happening. Colonel cleared his throat. Sir, what exactly are you proposing? General Hawkins stopped packing and looked directly at Maria. Ms. Santos, if you were given the resources and authority to implement the approach you're describing, how quickly could you begin providing us with more reliable intelligence assessment? Maria felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. I would need to reach out to my contacts, explain what we're trying to accomplish, and build a framework for cultural consultation. If I could work with a team that understands both intelligence needs and cultural sensitivity, I think we could start providing better analysis within a few weeks. This is insane, muttered, but she was ignored. General Hawkins returned to his seat and fixed Maria with that same intense stare that had started this entire surreal conversation. Ms. Santos, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. The room fell silent again. Maria could hear her own heartbeat as she waited for whatever was coming next. Are you prepared to take on significant responsibility for American lives and mission success, based on the cultural expertise you're claiming to possess? The weight of the question hit Maria like a physical blow. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. This was about real consequences, real people, real life and death decisions. She thought about the soldiers she had never met who were depending on accurate intelligence, about Afghan civilians caught in the crossfire, about the enormous responsibility that was being offered to her. Yes, sir, she said quietly but with absolute conviction. I am. General Hawkins nodded slowly, then turned to address the room. Ladies, I'm making an executive decision. Ms. Santos is going to be reassigned effective immediately to work directly with our intelligence assessment team. Her job will be to provide cultural context and analysis for intelligence coming out of Afghanistan. Shot to her feet, Sir, you cannot possibly. Ms., General Hawkins said, his voice cutting through her protest like a blade. You will arrange for Ms. Santos to receive appropriate security clearance immediately. You will also ensure that she has access to all relevant intelligence reports from the Afghanistan theater. Is that understood? His face was red with anger and embarrassment, but she managed to nod stiffly. General Hawkins turned back to Maria, and for the first time since he had walked into the room, she saw something that might have been a smile at the corner of his mouth. Welcome to the team, Ms. Santos. I have a feeling you're going to change everything. 6 months later, Maria sat in her own office, a real office with her name on the door and a window overlooking the Pentagon courtyard. The transformation from coffee-fetching intern to senior cultural intelligence analyst still felt surreal sometimes, but the stack of urgent reports on her desk was a constant reminder that her new reality was very real indeed. The specialized unit she now led had become known throughout the Pentagon as the Cultural Bridge Initiative, and their success in Afghanistan had exceeded everyone's expectations. Intelligence accuracy had improved by over 60% in the regions where they had implemented Maria's cultural mapping approach. And more importantly, civilian casualties had dropped significantly as military operations became more precisely targeted and culturally informed. Her phone buzzed with a call from Colonel. Maria, we need you in conference room A immediately. We've got a developing situation. She gathered her files and hurried down the familiar corridors, noting how different the experience was now. Instead of trying to make herself invisible, she walked with confidence, nodding to colleagues who treated her with respect and deference. The badge hanging around her neck now read Senior Analyst instead of Temporary Intern. But more importantly, people knew her name and valued her opinion. When she entered the conference room, she found it filled with many of the same officials who had been present that day 6 months ago. But now, instead of dismissive glances, she was greeted with expectant faces and cleared space at the main table. General Hawkins was already there, and he gestured for her to take the seat to his right. Maria, we've got a complex situation developing in the Helmand province. Initial intelligence reports are coming in, but they're contradictory, and we need cultural context before we can plan any response. She opened her laptop and pulled up the regional relationship maps her team had developed. What's the nature of the reports, sir? Major General Richardson leaned forward. We're getting information that suggests a major Taliban offensive is being planned, but our sources are giving us completely different timelines and target assessments. Some say it's imminent, others say it's weeks away, and some are reporting that it's been called off entirely. Maria nodded, already beginning to see the pattern. Have you identified which tribal areas the sources are from? That's just it, Colonel said, pulling up a digital map. They're all from the same general region, which is why the conflicting information is so puzzling. Maria studied the map, then cross-referenced it with her cultural database. I think I can explain the discrepancy. The Helmand province situation is complicated by the fact that there are 3 major tribal confederations operating in that area, and they all have different relationships with both coalition forces and Taliban elements. She stood and moved to the display screen, pulling up a detailed cultural map that showed tribal territories, family connections, and historical alliances. The sources reporting an imminent attack are likely from the tribal network. They have strong connections to government-aligned forces and tend to report Taliban activity quickly because they want coalition protection for their areas. General Hawkins studied the map intently, and the sources saying it's weeks away. Probably tribal connections. They historically try to maintain neutrality between different factions, so they tend to downplay immediate threats in hopes of avoiding conflict in their territories. When they report something as weeks away, they're often hoping that the situation will resolve itself without their areas becoming. Colonel frowned. What about the sources saying the offensive has been called off? Maria highlighted a different section of the map. Those are most likely connected to the network. They've been in direct negotiation with Taliban leadership about land rights and poppy cultivation territories. If they're saying the offensive is canceled, it might mean they've reached some kind of accommodation. The room was quiet as everyone processed this information. Major General Richardson was the first to speak. So you're saying all 3 reports might be accurate from their respective perspectives? Exactly. And more importantly, the pattern of reporting suggests that this isn't actually a single coordinated Taliban offensive. It's probably 3 separate regional conflicts that our intelligence gathering has been interpreting as one large operation. General Hawkins leaned back in his chair, and Maria could see the wheels turning in his mind. If that's the case, then the response strategy needs to be completely different. Instead of preparing for one major engagement, we need to address 3 distinct situations with 3 different approaches. I would recommend that, Maria agreed. But I'd also suggest that we reach out directly to the tribal leaders in each area. Based on the intelligence patterns, I think there might be an opportunity to prevent these conflicts entirely through negotiation rather than military action. Who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, finally spoke up. Ms. Santos, that's a very optimistic assessment. These are Taliban fighters we're talking about, not diplomatic partners. Maria turned to face, nodding the professional courtesy in her tone, but also the underlying skepticism. Their relationship had evolved over the months, but there was still tension there. Ms., that's exactly the kind of thinking that has kept us locked in cycles of violence. The fighters involved in these regional conflicts aren't necessarily ideological Taliban. Many of them are young men defending tribal territory or fighting over economic resources. She moved to another section of the display, pulling up economic data. The Helmand province produces about 70% of Afghanistan's opium. Most of these conflicts are really about poppy cultivation rights and trade route control. If we can address the underlying economic issues, we can often remove the motivation for fighting entirely. General Hawkins stood up and joined Maria at the display. What kind of economic intervention are you suggesting? Alternative crop development programs, but implemented through traditional tribal authority structures rather than top-down government initiatives. My contacts in the aid worker community have been developing some innovative approaches that respect cultural traditions while providing economic alternatives to opium cultivation. She pulled up several case studies. In the province, a similar program helped reduce opium production by 40% in 2 years while actually increasing farmer income. The key was working with tribal elders to develop solutions that fit within existing social structures. Colonel studied the data. The timeline for that kind of intervention would be months or years. We need to address the immediate security threat. Maria nodded. which is why I suggest a two-track approach. Immediate diplomatic outreach to prevent the conflicts from escalating, combined with longer-term economic development to address the root causes. My team has already identified the key tribal leaders who would need to be involved in negotiations. General Hawkins returned to his seat, but his attention remained focused on Maria. You believe these tribal leaders would be willing to negotiate? I think they're probably hopping for exactly that opportunity. The intelligence patterns suggest that nobody really wants these conflicts to escalate. The reporting inconsistencies might actually be attempts to signal willingness to negotiate without losing face with their own constituencies. The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. Maria could see the shift in thinking happening around the table. 6 months ago, the automatic response would have been to prepare for military action. Now, they were seriously considering diplomatic and economic solutions. Major General Richardson looked up from her notes. Maria, if we decided to pursue this negotiation track, how quickly could your team arrange contact with the relevant tribal leaders? I could have preliminary conversations started within 48 hours. My contacts include aid workers who have established relationships with all 3 tribal networks and several journalists who could serve as neutral intermediaries if needed. General Hawkins made a decision. Do it, but I want detailed daily reports, and if there's any indication that negotiation isn't working, we'll need to be prepared for military response. Understood, sir. As the meeting began to wind down, General Hawkins asked everyone else to leave except for Maria. When the room was empty, he turned to her with the same intense expression that had started her transformation 6 months ago. Maria, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. She felt a familiar flutter of nervousness, but also the confidence that came from months of proven success. Of course, sir. Do you ever regret leaving your coffee cart behind? The question was so unexpected that Maria laughed out loud. Sir, I have to say that fetching coffee was never really my dream career. General Hawkins smiled, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. I had a feeling about that. He paused, his expression becoming more serious. Maria, what you've accomplished in the past 6 months has been remarkable. You've changed not just how we approach intelligence in Afghanistan, but how we think about cultural factors in all our operations. Thank you, sir. It's been the opportunity of a lifetime. And it's just the beginning. I've been asked to brief the Joint Chiefs on expanding the Cultural Bridge initiative to other theaters of operation. How would you feel about taking on a role that would involve developing cultural intelligence programs for multiple regions around the world? Maria felt her breath catch. The scope of what he was describing was beyond anything she had imagined when she started bringing coffee to morning meetings. Sir, I would be honored by that opportunity. General Hawkins stood up and extended his hand. Congratulations, Director Santos. Your new assignment begins Monday. As Maria shook his hand, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been invisible, dismissed as just another intern whose only value was her ability to operate a coffee machine. Now she was being offered the chance to reshape how the American military approached cultural understanding on a global scale. Walking back to her office, Maria passed the small administrative area where she had worked as assistant. The coffee cart was still there, now operated by a new intern who looked just as overwhelmed and underestimated as Maria had felt. She made a mental note to stop by later and introduce herself. You never knew what hidden talents might be brewing coffee in the Pentagon's corridors. Her phone buzzed with a message from one of her contacts in Afghanistan. The tribal leader from the Confederation was interested in preliminary discussions about the Helmand situation. The message was brief, but it represented exactly the kind of breakthrough that had made Maria's career possible. As she settled back at her desk to begin coordinating what would potentially prevent a major military conflict through diplomacy and cultural understanding, Maria smiled at the thought of how wrong first impressions could be. General Hawkins had looked up that day and seen something that everyone else had missed. But more importantly, he had been willing to give her the chance to prove that there was more to her story than anyone had bothered to discover. The coffee cart had been her beginning, but it was never going to be her ending. And now, with the responsibility and authority to make a real difference in conflicts around the world, Maria Santos was just getting started.